Jerome Powell just made a move that has the entire financial world talking, and the White House is not happy about it. Most people assumed that once Powell stepped down as Federal Reserve Chairman, he would simply walk out the door, take his legacy with him, and disappear from Washington. That's the normal playbook. That's what everyone expected, but Powell is not following the normal playbook, and what he's doing instead could shake up the entire future of American economic policy for the next 2 years. Here's what's really happening. Jerome Powell confirmed this week that he is staying inside the Federal Reserve Building even after his term as chairman expires on May 15th. He is not leaving. He is not riding off into the sunset. He is planting his feet, sitting down at the table, and staying on as a member of the Fed's Board of Governors, a position he is legally entitled to hold all the way until early 2028. Let that sink in for a second. The man Donald Trump has been feuding with for years over interest rates, the man Trump has publicly humiliated on social media, the man Trump wanted gone, is staying right there, inside the building, possibly influencing the very interest rate decisions that Trump's entire second-term economic agenda depends on. And Washington is absolutely buzzing right now. Let's break this down from the beginning, because there are several layers to this story, and if you only catch the headline, you're going to miss the part that really matters. Jerome Powell is 73 years old. He was first appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors back in 2012, and Trump originally elevated him to chairman in 2018. That relationship, almost from the start, was rocky. Trump wanted rates low. Trump wanted cheap money flowing through the economy to fuel growth and boost markets. Powell, a trained lawyer who came from the private equity world rather than traditional economics, took a more cautious approach. He moved at the pace he believed the data supported, not the pace a president running for re-election wanted. That tension never really went away. And now, even as Powell's chairmanship formally ends this month, the story between these two men is far from over. When Powell publicly announced he would be staying on as a governor, he didn't mince words about why. He pointed directly to what he called legal attacks on the Fed, and he described those attacks as battering the institution. That's not soft language. That is a Federal Reserve chairman using his final days in the top seat to sound an alarm about what he sees as a direct threat to the central bank's independence. What legal attacks is he talking about? Here's where the story gets complicated, and frankly, a little stunning. There are allegations swirling around Powell related to a $2.5 billion renovation of the Federal Reserve's headquarters building in Washington. The Trump administration has raised questions about whether Powell misled Congress about cost overruns on that construction project. Now, to be clear, Powell himself has denied any wrongdoing. Senator Thom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina, has called the allegations bogus, and Powell's allies have pushed back hard on the entire framing of the situation. But here's the key detail. The Justice Department, now under Jeanine Pirro, yes, the former prosecutor and television personality whom Trump appointed as a top official in his administration, was looking into this matter. And when Pirro announced she was handing the probe over to the Fed's own Inspector General, she made a point of saying publicly that she would not hesitate to restart a criminal investigation should the facts warrant doing so. That statement landed like a grenade, because think about what that means for Powell. He is standing at a crossroads. On one path, he walks out the door and potentially faces a Department of Justice investigation outside the relative protection of his institutional role. On the other path, he stays inside the Fed as a governor, maintains his legal standing, and remains a visible, prominent figure who would be much harder to quietly prosecute without enormous public blowback. People close to Powell told the New York Post exactly this. One Wall Street executive with direct ties to Powell put it simply, if everything is clean, he will leave shortly. If there is some kind of litigation against him or the institution, he will stay as a governor for up to 2 years. 2 years. That would take us all the way to early 2028, which, not coincidentally, is right in the middle of what would be Trump's second term. So suddenly what looked like a simple retirement story has transformed into something much more complex. This is a legal chess match playing out at the highest levels of American government and finance, and the stakes could not be higher. Now, let's talk about the reaction, because this is where things get almost surreal. Economists and observers close to the White House are not exactly hiding their frustration. One economist with direct ties to the Trump administration told the New York Post, and I want to make sure you appreciate the tone here. He said his advice was to take away Powell's parking privileges in the Fed building, and then he added that he was not joking. He went further, suggesting that maybe they should move Powell's office into the basement of the Fed building, specifically the part of the basement where water is seeping in due to all the ongoing construction work. That is the level of frustration we are talking about. We have serious economic policy advisors to the White House floating the idea of using parking spaces and leaky basements as tools to make Jerome Powell uncomfortable enough to resign. It would almost be funny if the underlying situation weren't so genuinely consequential. And then there is the Truth Social angle. Because of course, there is. President Trump posted about Powell directly, writing that Powell wants to stay at the Fed because he can't get a job anywhere else. Nobody wants him. That is the sitting president of the United States, writing publicly about the outgoing chairman of the world's most powerful central bank, suggesting he is unemployable. Most people glossed over that post. But what this means is that Trump is not treating this as a quiet transition of power at the Fed. He is actively, publicly, and vocally trying to pressure Powell to leave. And Powell is not budging. Now let's zoom out, because there is a much bigger picture here that most coverage is missing entirely. The reason the Trump team wants Powell gone is not just personal. It is deeply, urgently economic. Trump's second term has been defined by a push for lower interest rates. Lower rates mean cheaper borrowing for businesses. Lower rates mean more economic activity, more consumer spending, more of the momentum that Trump wants to associate with his administration. For months, Trump has been vocal, sometimes explicitly, sometimes between the lines, about his desire for the Fed to cut rates aggressively. Powell, throughout his chairmanship, resisted that pressure. He kept rates at levels he believed were appropriate given the inflation data, regardless of what the White House wanted. And that independence, the Fed's ability to make monetary policy decisions free from political pressure, is one of the foundational principles of the American economic system. It's one of the reasons global markets trust the dollar. It's one of the reasons investors treat U.S. Treasury bonds as a safe haven. When that independence looks threatened, markets notice, and they get nervous. Enter Kevin Warsh. Trump's pick to replace Powell as Fed chairman is a former Federal Reserve governor himself, a man with deep financial market connections and a reputation as an inflation hawk. Warsh has signaled he may be willing to cut interest rates, which aligns with what Trump wants. But Warsh has also made clear he wants to reduce the size of the Federal Reserve's massive balance sheet, which he believes has been a primary driver of inflation staying stubbornly above the Fed's 2% target. So Warsh is not simply a rubber stamp for whatever the White House wants. He has his own economic philosophy, and it does not perfectly align with Trump's agenda either. This transition is more complicated than it looks from the outside. But here is the critical wrinkle that very few people are talking about. Even if Kevin Warsh takes over as chairman, he cannot simply snap his fingers and cut interest rates. That is not how the Federal Reserve works. Interest rate decisions are made by the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, which is a body of multiple governors and regional bank presidents. No single person, not even the chairman, has unilateral control over those decisions. And if Jerome Powell stays on as a governor, he gets a seat at that table. He gets a vote. He could, depending on how the committee is composed and how votes align, be a pivotal voice against cutting rates, even under a new chairman. That is the scenario that has people in the Trump orbit so agitated. The man they spent years fighting with over monetary policy does not just disappear. He sits down right across from their new chairman and potentially continues to influence the very decisions they fought so hard to change. Unless, as one observer put it with a certain dark humor, Team Trump makes life miserable enough for Powell as governor that he eventually decides the fight isn't worth it and walks away voluntarily. Which brings us back to the parking spots and the leaky basements. There is a real question about how far this could go. Can the Trump administration legally make Powell's life difficult enough to push him out? There are significant constraints on what they can actually do. Powell has legal protections as a governor. You can't simply fire him without cause. The Fed's independence, while under pressure, still has legal and institutional frameworks protecting it. Attempting to overtly undermine a sitting governor of the Federal Reserve would create enormous legal and political complications, and likely trigger exactly the kind of market anxiety that the administration would want to avoid. But there are subtler levers. The atmosphere inside an institution can be changed. The resources available to a governor can be adjusted. The legal pressure from a Department of Justice that has already shown it is willing to open investigations can be turned up or down. These are the kinds of factors that Powell and his advisors are clearly weighing as they decide how long he stays. And the Wall Street community is watching all of this extremely closely. Financial markets have been navigating an environment of tremendous uncertainty. Interest rate expectations drive enormous amounts of investment decision-making, from mortgage rates to corporate bond yields to stock valuations. Anytime there is confusion or conflict about what the Fed is going to do next, markets respond. Sometimes they respond with volatility. And given everything that is already swirling in the economic environment right now, from trade policy to fiscal debates to global uncertainty, the last thing many investors want is additional drama at the Federal Reserve. Most people think of the Fed as this dry, technical institution that just sets numbers, but the truth is, the Fed's credibility, its reputation for independence, for making decisions based on economic data rather than political pressure, is one of the most valuable assets the United States has in the global financial system. When that credibility looks shaky, foreign investors notice. When the U.S. dollar's reserve currency status looks like it might be tangled up in political fights, the long-term consequences can be significant. That is why so many serious economists, including many who might otherwise agree with Trump on other policy issues, get genuinely worried when they see the kind of public pressure campaign being waged against Powell and the Fed. Now, where does this all go from here? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. The economist close to Trump who floated the parking spot idea followed it up by saying his betting is that Powell might stay for a bit but will decide to leave. That is probably the consensus view among people watching this closely. The pressure is real, the legal cloud is uncomfortable, and Powell at 73 may ultimately decide that the fight is simply not worth it. But might stay for a bit is doing a lot of work in that sentence. A few months of Powell sitting at the FOMC table, casting votes, being publicly present as a symbol of institutional resistance to political pressure. That is a significant variable in what happens to monetary policy in the near term. And if the legal situation does not resolve cleanly, and Powell decides to dig in for the long haul, we could be looking at years of tension inside the most important financial institution in the world. What makes this moment historically unusual is that we are not just watching a personnel transition at the Fed. We are watching a confrontation between the principle of central bank independence and the political priorities of a presidency that has been unusually direct about wanting to influence monetary policy. Most presidents keep their opinions about the Fed relatively private, at least by tradition. Trump has never operated that way. And now, even as his preferred successor is about to take the chairman's seat, the man he wanted gone is sitting down next to him and saying he is not finished yet. The parking spot joke is funny, but it tells you something real about the frustration inside this situation. When the tools at your disposal to remove someone you want gone amount to symbolic gestures, revoking parking privileges, moving offices to the basement, it means the actual legal and institutional barriers to simply forcing someone out are holding, at least for now. Whether those barriers continue to hold, whether Powell stays or goes, whether the legal pressure escalates or fades, whether Kevin Warsh ends up in a confrontational or collaborative relationship with his predecessor still sitting in the building, all of that is going to unfold over the coming weeks and months, and it is going to matter, not just inside Washington, not just for politics, but for mortgages, for business loans, for inflation, for the economy that every single American is living inside of every single day. So here's the question worth sitting with as this story continues to develop. What does it say about the current moment in American governance when the most powerful economic institution in the country is at the center of a battle between legal protection and political pressure, and the most visible tool being suggested to resolve it is taking away someone's parking spot? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this story is not close to over.